Welcome back, everyone. When we last left off, we had just witnessed this exchange between Jesus and the religious leaders concerning paying taxes to Rome, right? It was supposed to be a gotcha moment for the religious leaders, but Jesus quickly foiled their plans and continued on teaching. Well, we go all the way up to Thursday in chapter 33, right? The religious leaders are still there. They're still in the crowds. And in Matthew 23 and verse 1, it says this. It says, "Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples," right? While looking at the religious leaders, right? And probably gesturing towards them, Jesus said this to the crowds. He said, "The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must be careful to do everything they tell you." Right? And I'm sure all the religious leaders at that, they start nodding their heads and say, "That's right. You have to do everything we tell you." Right? They're nodding their heads in agreement. But Jesus says, "Do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Everything they do is done for people to see. And they make their phylacteries wide and their tassels on their garments long. And they love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love, verse 7, to be greeted with respect in all the marketplaces and to be called rabbi by others." Right? Jesus goes on, right? And it's this big, huge slap in the face of these religious leaders. And then Jesus says this in verse 13. He says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees. You are hypocrites. You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to." Verse 15, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees. You are hypocrites. You travel over land and sea to win a single convert. And when they have succeeded, you make them twice as much a child of hell as you are." Right? Jesus, he is right up in their faces, right? And he goes on to make 7 statements like this until finally, way down in verse 29, Jesus says this to him. He says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees. You are hypocrites. You build tombs for the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous. And you say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would not have taken part with them in the shedding the blood of the prophets. And so you testify against yourselves that you are the descendants of those who murder the prophets." Jesus says, "Go ahead then and complete what your ancestors have started." Jesus says, "You snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell?" Right? Jesus is going after them, right? And you can imagine the crowd, right? They have been moved into just dead silence. Listen to this, to Jesus scolding these Pharisees. Right? Never mind the disciples, right? Right? These disciples are sitting up front with Jesus and right and there and you probably they're just like, right? They are in shock. And at that, Jesus turns his back and he leaves and he crosses the Kidron Valley and he goes up the Mount of Olives towards Bethany. And the disciples, they're following behind him. And right as he is steaming up the Mount of Olives, right, they're running up and they catch up to him. And one of them says, right, probably just to try to ease the tension in Matthew 24, he says, "Boy, right, don't those buildings look pretty today?" And on that, Jesus turns on the disciples and he says, "Do you see these things? Not one stone will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down." Right? Jesus, he is fired up. Well, later that night, they have the Passover meal. And when they gather together in an upper room, right, which many scholars believe is the home of Mary, the mother of Mark, right, Jesus tells them to go into the city and find this place and everything will be ready. Well, just as Jesus had the donkeys ready, he already has the room prepared also. Right? Think about this. The population of Jerusalem will go from around 100,000 people to closely 1 million people during the Passover week. And so if you want a private room for your Passover meal, well, then you better make reservations, right? You better make some arrangements beforehand. And Mary, the mother of Mark, right, is a disciple of Jesus, right? And we meet her over in Acts. Right after the resurrection, after the ascension, right? Whenever there is trouble, all the believers know where they are to go and meet and gather, right? They go to the home of Mary, the mother of Mark. Right, when Peter is arrested by Herod, right, he's going to be put to death. But remember, he miraculously gets out of jail in the middle of the night. Right, meanwhile, all the believers, they're gathered at the home of Mary, the mother of Mark, and they're there and they're praying for Peter. Right, when Peter gets out of jail, remember, an angel breaks him out of jail and he makes his way by night back through the back alleys and through the shadows, and he goes to the home of Mary, the mother of Mark. Right, and everybody seems to know where to go. Right, it is the safe house in Jerusalem. Right, if there is a problem, you go to Mary's house. Right, that's a safe house. Right, and it's very likely the same room that we have here for the Last Supper. In Matthew chapter 26 and verse 17, it says this. It says, on the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, right? That would be Passover, right? The disciples came to Jesus and asked, where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover meal? Jesus gives them the directions. Indeed, everything has already been prepared. Right? Meanwhile, Judas has cut a deal with the religious leaders to turn Jesus over to them. Now think about this. Why would Judas do this? Now we typically have a very narrow view of Judas. But I think the character of Judas is far more complex than we typically give him credit for. Think about this. Judas is a disciple. He's an apostle, right? That is in Acts, right? When we learn that the disciples are going to replace Judas, they nominate two people, right? And the criterion for being nominated is that you were with Jesus, right? Physically present as an eyewitness from his baptism with John the Baptist in the Jordan River, right? Through his entire 3 years of public ministry, right? Through his death, his burial, his resurrection, and his ascension, right? You were an eyewitness to all of these events, right? And the capital A apostles were eyewitnesses. Right? Peter emphasizes that in 2 Peter, right? His last letter written to the church in AD 68. Remember, Peter is in the Mamertine prison, right? He is about to be executed. He is about to be put to death. And he writes his final epistle. And in it, he says in 2 Peter chapter 1 and at verse 12, he says this. He says, so I will always remind you of these things. What things? These foundational teachings. He says, even though you know them and are firmly established in the truth you now have. Verse 15 says, I think it is right to refresh your memory as long as I live in the tent of this body. Right? Because I know that I will soon be put aside. That is, my death warrant has been signed. My execution has been scheduled. Right? I am not going to be here much longer. And so he says, I want to make sure that these foundational teachings are remembered. Right? And what is the most important one? Right? What's number one? Verse 16, for we, right, that being the apostles, capital A apostles, did not follow cleverly devised stories when we told you about the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ in power. But we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. He says we were there. We saw it with our very own eyes. And so to be an apostle, you must be an eyewitness of the entire public ministry of Jesus, from his baptism to his ascension. Well, Judas fit that criterion. Right? He was an eyewitness of Jesus' arrest, his death on the cross. And he was there in Caesarea Philippi. And he concurred, right? Yes, Jesus, you are the Messiah. You are the Son of the living God. See, Judas knew that. And so why would he turn Jesus over? Well, I think that Judas absolutely believed that Jesus was the Messiah. He absolutely believed that he was the Son of the living God. But what was Jesus doing? Right? What he was doing was not what anyone thought the Messiah should do. Remember what Jesus said coming from Caesarea Philippi, right? That we are going to go to Jerusalem. I will be betrayed. I'll be arrested. I'll be tried. I'll be convicted. I'll be executed. And I'll be raised on the third day. And remember what Peter's response was. Peter said, "No, not Lord, not on my watch. No, you won't." And remember what Jesus says? He says, "Then get behind me, Satan." In other words, Peter, you either lead, follow, or you get out of the way. Right? This is not your agenda. This is my agenda. Right? When Jesus came to Jerusalem, right, all the apostles expected him to present himself before the Sanhedrin, right? And you would treat the high priest respectfully. Why? Because he's the high priest, right? He's the high priest of God. But Jesus has no respect for him whatsoever, right? And he savages the religious leaders, and he taunts them, and he ridicules them in front of the large crowds. And so what is he doing? Right? And I think Judas absolutely believed that Jesus was the Messiah. But as the week went on, right, and tensions were escalating, right? He's got to be thinking to himself, man, I just don't get it, right? I know that he's the Messiah, right? And they, right, out of necessity must know that he is the Messiah. I've got to figure out a way to let them know this. Right? But this whole thing with the crowds and the religious leaders, and they're feeding off one another, and they're playing off the crowds. And so Judas thinks, man, if I can just get Jesus and the religious leaders away from the crowds and into a room where they can meet privately, if I can just get them together where they can talk, right, then they will understand each other, right? And then the plan will go on as I think it's supposed to go on, and Jesus will become the Messiah, will be the Messiah, and everything will work out right, right? I think Judas has really good intentions here. And so he agrees to bring men to Jesus in the garden, at the Garden of Eden, right, where Jesus would often go, and they would have the meeting that night, right, apart from the crowds and not triggering that riot that everybody is so afraid of. Right, I think that Judas was told that, if you can just bring him to us, right, then we would have a private meeting in the home of Caiaphas, the high priest, and everything will work itself out. Right, that is what Judas is hoping for. Right, when Jesus is arrested, right, he is brought to the home of Caiaphas, the high priest. But there, things go terribly wrong. Right there, Jesus is condemned. Right, he is accused of blasphemy. Right, a capital offense under the Mosaic law. He is found guilty of blasphemy, and he is sentenced to death by the religious leaders. But they can't carry out that penalty. Why? Because they're living under Roman law. And so, if they want Jesus dead, it has to be done at the hands of the Romans. So that they take Jesus to Pilate at the Antonia fortress, and they file their accusations. And what is their accusation? Is it blasphemy? No. Right? Under the Roman law, freedom of religion is guaranteed. Right? You can worship any god you want. Right? You can worship Egyptian gods, Greek gods, Roman gods. It doesn't matter. Right? It is a very pluralistic society in the Roman Empire, and you have religious rights that are very protected. And so Jesus is accused not of blasphemy, right? No, he is accused of claiming to be a king, right? And that is treason, and that is a capital offense. And in the end, that is what Jesus is executed for. He is nailed to a Roman cross as a convicted felon, one who claimed to be a king and overthrow the Roman Empire, right? They call him King of Kings. Well, Judas makes his decision, right? And if we are correct, when things go terribly bad, right? Jesus is convicted and sentenced to death and nailed to the cross. What does Judas do? Right? He is horrified, remember? Right? He goes back and he throws that money at the religious leaders and says, right, you've condemned an innocent man. What are you doing? They don't care at all. And then what does Judas do next? Remember, he went out and he hanged himself. Right? Now, that's not a reaction of a man whose plan has all worked out. Right? No, his plan has gone terribly, horribly wrong. Judas is broken. Judas hangs himself. So I think Judas is a much more complex character than he is often portrayed. Well, Judas is there at the Last Supper, but he leaves early on. Right? Jesus tells him, right? Do what you're going to do, right? Jesus knew he was going to do it. And so why didn't Jesus stop him? Because Jesus is there for the purpose, the explicit purpose of going to the cross, right? Jesus ensures that he does everything to make that happen on his schedule.